We rested in silence for some time. Don Juan covered his face with his hat and remained motionless as if he were asleep. I became absorbed in writing my notes until he made a sudden movement that made me jolt. He sat up abruptly and faced me, frowning. "You have a knack for hunting," he said, "and that's what you should learn. Hunting. We are not going to talk about plants anymore." He puffed out his jaws for an instant, then candidly added, "I don't think we ever have anyway, have we?" and laughed. We spent the rest of the day walking in every direction while he gave me an unbelievably detailed explanation about rattlesnakes. The way they nest, the way they move around, their seasonal habits, their quirks and behavior. Then he proceeded to corroborate each of the points he had made, and finally he caught and killed a large snake. He cut off its head, cleaned its viscera, skinned it, and roasted the meat. His movements had such a grace and skill that it was a sheer pleasure just to be around him. I had listened to him and watched him spellbound. My concentration had been so complete that the rest of the world had practically vanished for me. Eating the snake was a hard re-entry into the world of ordinary affairs. I felt nauseated when I began to chew a bite of snake meat. It was an ill-founded queasiness as the meat was delicious, but my stomach seemed to be rather an independent unit. I could hardly swallow at all. I thought Don Juan would have a heart attack from laughing so hard. Afterwards, we sat down for a leisurely rest in the shade of some rocks. I began to work on my notes, and the quantity of them made me realize that he had given me an astonishing amount of information about rattlesnakes. "Your hunter's spirit has returned to you," Don Juan said suddenly and with a serious face. "Now you're hooked." "I beg your pardon?" I wanted him to elaborate on his statement that I was hooked, but he only laughed and repeated it. "How am I hooked?" I insisted. "Hunters will always hunt," he said. "I am a hunter myself." "Do you mean you hunt for a living?" "I hunt in order to live. I can live off the land anywhere." He indicated the total surroundings with his hand. "To be a hunter means that one knows a great deal," he went on. "It means that one can see the world in different ways. In order to be a hunter, one must be in perfect balance with everything else. Otherwise, hunting would become a meaningless chore. For instance, today, we took a little snake. I had to apologize to her for cutting her life off so suddenly and so definitely. I did what I did knowing that my own life will also be cut off someday in very much the same fashion. Suddenly and definitely. So all in all, we and the snakes are on a par. One of them fed us today. I had never conceived a balance of that kind when I used to hunt," I said. "That's not true. You didn't just kill animals. You and your family ate the game." His statements carried the conviction of someone who had been there. He was, of course, right. There had been times when I had provided the incidental wild meat for my family. After a moment's hesitation, I asked, "How did you know that?" "There are certain things that I just know," he said. "I can't tell you how, though." I told him that my aunts and uncles would very seriously call all the birds I would bag pheasants. Don Juan said he could easily imagine them calling a sparrow a tiny pheasant, and added a comical rendition of how they would chew it. The extraordinary movements of his jaw gave me the feeling that he was actually chewing a whole bird, bones and all. "I really think that you have a touch for hunting," he said, staring at me, "and we have been barking up the wrong tree. Perhaps you will be willing to change your way of life in order to become a hunter." He reminded me that I had found out, with just a little exertion on my part, that in the world there were good and bad spots for me. He added that I had also found out the specific colors associated with them. That means you have a knack for hunting, he declared. Not everyone who tries would find their colors and their spots at the same time. To be a hunter sounded very nice and romantic, but it was an absurdity for me, since I did not particularly care to hunt. You don't have to care to hunt, or to like it, he replied to my complaint. You have a natural inclination. I think the best hunters never like hunting. They do it well, that's all. I had the feeling that Don Juan was capable of arguing his way out of anything, and yet he maintained that he did not like to talk at all. It is like what I've told you about hunters, he said. I don't necessarily like to talk. I just have a knack for it, and I do it well. That's all. I found his mental agility truly funny. Hunters must be exceptionally tight individuals, he continued. A hunter leaves very little to chance. I have been trying all along to convince you that you must learn to live in a different way. So far I have not succeeded. There was nothing you could have grabbed onto. Now it's different. I've brought back your old hunter's spirit. Perhaps through it you will change. I protested that I did not want to become a hunter. I reminded him that in the beginning I had just wanted him to tell me about medicinal plants, but he had made me stray so far away from my original purpose that I could not clearly recall anymore whether or not I had really wanted to learn about plants. Good, he said, really good. If you don't have such a clear picture of what you want, you may become more humble. Let's put it this way. For your purposes, it doesn't really matter whether you learn about plants or about hunting. You've told me that yourself. You are interested in anything that anyone can tell you. True? I had said that to him in trying to define the scope of anthropology and in order to draft him as my informant. Don Juan chuckled, obviously aware of his control over the situation. I am a hunter, he said, as if he were reading my thoughts. I leave very little to chance. Perhaps I should explain to you that I learned to be a hunter. I have not always lived the way I do now. At one point in my life, I had to change. Now I'm pointing the direction to you. I'm guiding you. I know what I'm talking about. Someone taught me all this. I didn't figure it out for myself. Do you mean you had a teacher, Don Juan? Let's say that someone taught me to hunt the way I want to teach you now, he said, and quickly changed the topic. I think that once upon a time hunting was one of the greatest acts a man could perform, he said. All hunters were powerful men. In fact, a hunter had to be powerful to begin with in order to withstand the rigors of that life. Suddenly I became curious. Was he referring to a time perhaps prior to the conquest? I began to probe him. When was the time you were talking about? Once upon a time. When? What does once upon a time mean? It means once upon a time. Or maybe it means now today. It doesn't matter. At one time, everybody knew that a hunter was the best man. Now not everyone knows that. But there are a sufficient number of people who do. I know it. Someday you will. See what I mean? Do the Yaqui Indians feel that way about hunters? That's what I want to know. Not necessarily. Do the Pima Indians? Not all of them, but some. I named various neighboring groups. I wanted to commit him to a statement that hunting was a shared belief and practice of some specific people, but he avoided answering me directly, so I changed the subject. Why are you doing all this for me, Don Juan? I asked. He took his hat off and scratched his temples in feigned bafflement. "I am having a gesture with you," he said softly. "Other people have had similar gestures with you. Someday you yourself would have the same gesture with others. Let's say that it is my turn. One day I found out that if I wanted to be a hunter worthy of self-respect, I had to change my way of life. I used to whine and complain a great deal. I had good reasons to feel shortchanged. I am an Indian, and Indians are treated like dogs. There was nothing I could do to remedy that, so all I was left with was my sorrow. But then my good fortune spared me and someone taught me to hunt. And I realized that the way I lived was not worth living, so I changed it. But I am happy with my life, Don Juan. Why should I have to change it?" He began to sing a Mexican song very softly, and then hummed the tune. His head bobbed up and down as he followed the beat of the song. "Do you think that you and I are equals?" he asked in a sharp voice. His question caught me off guard. I experienced a peculiar buzzing in my ear as though he had actually shouted his words, which he had not done. However, there had been a metallic sound in his voice that was reverberating in my ears. I scratched the inside of my left ear with the small finger of my left hand. My ears itched all the time, and I had developed a rhythmical, nervous way of rubbing the inside of them with the small finger of either hand. The movement was more properly a shake of my whole arm. Don Juan watched my movements with apparent fascination. "Well, are we equals?" he asked. "Of course we're equals," I said. I was naturally being condescending. I felt very warm towards him, even though at times I did not know what to do with him. Yet I still held in the back of my mind, although I would never voice it, the belief that I, being a university student, a man of the sophisticated Western world, was superior to an Indian. "No," he said calmly, "we are not." "Why, certainly we are," I protested. "No," he said in a soft voice, "we are not equals. I am a hunter and a warrior, and you are a pimp." My mouth fell open. I could not believe that Don Juan had actually said that. I dropped my notebook and stared at him dumbfoundedly, and then of course I became furious. He looked at me with calm and collected eyes. I avoided his gaze, and then he began to talk. He enunciated his words clearly. They poured out smoothly and deadly. He said that I was pimping for someone else, that I was not fighting my own battles, but the battles of some unknown people, that I did not want to learn about plants, or about hunting, or about anything, and that his world of precise acts and feelings and decisions was infinitely more effective than the blundering idiocy I called my life. After he finished talking, I was numb. He had spoken without belligerence or conceit, but with such power and yet such calmness that I was not even angry anymore. We remained silent. I felt embarrassed and could not think of anything appropriate to say. I waited for him to break the silence. Hours went by. Don Juan became motionless by degrees until his body had acquired a strange, almost frightening rigidity. His silhouette became difficult to make out as it got dark, and finally, when it was pitch black around us, he seemed to have merged into the blackness of the stones. His state of motionlessness was so total that it was as if he did not exist any longer. It was midnight when I finally realized that he could and would stay motionless there in that wilderness, in those rocks, perhaps forever if he had to. His world of precise acts and feelings and decisions was indeed superior. I quietly touched his arm, and tears flooded me.